everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Liquid Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Karl Meisterheim. Joining with me, as always, is our excellent Taylor Page. Hello, Taylor.
Hello, Carl. Hello.
And this week, we're very excited to have a very special guest, all the way from London, Leigh Barnes, former CTO of We Are 8, all-around great guy and Shopify developer extraordinaire. Leigh, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. This is awesome. Really stoked to be here.
We're excited to have you, and I'm speaking very loudly because I know it's a long way from Ohio to where you're at, and
Yeah, the
the bits
latency is
tend to scatter.
massive.
So, yeah. Speaking of latency, let's talk about life. Taylor, what you been up to these last few days or weeks?
Yeah, last couple of weeks, since we last chatted, I feel like I've got to say not a whole lot as far as the development side of things. So I don't know if y'all have ever run into this or whatever, but mainly I work in Shopify themes, building custom sections or extending functionality and these sorts of things or what have you. And last month was just a lot of troubleshooting. There was just like a whole series of like, hey, we had this problem with this order, or this customer was able to do this and they shouldn't have been. And so trying to like backtrack and figure a whole bunch of stuff out. And I don't feel like I built a whole lot last month. And so it didn't feel super productive. And that's always kind of a bummer. But finally have been able to get into it a little bit this week. I did feel pretty cool. Because I'm like, working in front end Shopify themes primarily and trying to slowly inch my way into like the app dev space. And so I did help work with one little bit of GraphQL to try to track down a random discount code that this person was able to like leverage, and the shop was trying to figure it out. So the Shopify GraphQL app or whatever, like I've got that now. That's like a standard in all the shops I'm working with, is just like, nope, we need this so we can troubleshoot, because they're like, where'd this discount code come from? And so they were, concerned it was like, oh, it's this loyalty program app we're using, or oh, it's the returns app program that we're using. And so it turns out it was just because of a misconfigured basically discount code in the email marketing app that they were using. And so got it figured out, because there's a handy way to figure out who authored a discount code. You can't do
Oh,
it natively, which is annoying, but you can do it with the GraphQL app. So that was super helpful to be able to do something like that. I learned a little bit more about GraphQL, and that's always good as well. I feel like I used to know a lot more about it until I've worked a lot in themes, and now not so much. So, and then personal. My son started soccer, so that's really exciting
ooh,
for me. Not so much so because I'm a soccer person. I know nothing about soccer. I've
Taylor,
learned what little bit
Taylor,
I have. Yeah.
it's football. Lee's here. It's
Oh, sorry.
football.
Apologize. Football. Lee. But yeah, the American translation there. But so my kids are just getting to the point where they can participate in sports. They haven't been able to do that before, so it's more like, oh, just play. And he's actually enjoying it. Like, he did his first practice, and the next morning he woke up and was like, we got him one of these little tethers that you wrap around, and so you can kind of kick the ball and it comes back to you or whatever.
Oh,
And so he was just doing that like in the living room. He woke up first thing in the morning, he's like, I want to practice. And I was like, okay, cool, man, like go for it. So I'm trying to learn more about football, because I know very little. I'm
You can
much more familiar with the American football.
you can call it soccer.
So,
Where I grew up, we called it
I
soccer.
call it
It's
soccer. It's
naming
not
each
too
other.
offensive.
Nah.
Okay, okay. Yeah. But so yeah, that's been how things have been going in that realm. And my daughter also started tennis, so that was
oh.
kind of fun too. So my kids are
Does she
both
love it?
younger. Not really. She's very, very social, and so she likes the aspect of like going to it, meeting new people. So she's so fun, and she's really, really smart with stuff. So we actually signed her up for soccer, because but it's not for another couple of months. But she's always, I don't know if any of your kids have done this, but they like. We talk about soccer. She's like, "Yeah, I want to do it." Like, and then it's time to sign up, and she's like, "Nah, it's okay. Like, I want to do it or whatever, you know." And
Empty
and
face there.
she's done this multiple times, and so we finally were like, "Hey, do you want to do soccer?" We only asked her the one time, and she's like, "Yeah, I'd like to do soccer." And we're like, "Okay, great." And then like 2 weeks later, we're like, "Hey, we signed you up for soccer." So we'll see how that goes. That might come back to bite me, but
Yeah,
but yeah,
awesome.
that's personal and professional. That's what's going on this side of the pond.
Now, Lee, we'll really dig into you here in a second, but just to begin with, what's you been up to? What's your week been going? Anything interesting popping up?
My week, actually, my son started playing football like 2 weeks ago. So that's been kind of
Nice.
interesting. Otherwise, interesting
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, I don't know. It's been a whole bunch of like running, trail running, stuff recently. So that's been
Oh,
my
wow.
primary
Trail
focus
running. Okay.
outside a bit of consultancy and stuff like that. So yeah, not a whole bunch of fun stuff, but yeah.
Is the weather getting better over there for trail running and whatnot, or are you having to
I
slog through some bad weather?
I mean, I kind of live for the real bad weather. Like when I see a massive storm that's
Really?
like kicking through, that's the days when I want to be out. Um, but it's been so mild
Okay.
this winter. I think it's still coming. I think like we're gonna get like a little cold spell just before it hits into spring. So yeah, it's been a real
Uh-huh.
mild UK winter.
Nice. Now, do you do races, or is this just what you do for fun, like training and
No, this
running
is
out
just
doing
what I
trail
do for
running?
fun. Yeah, just for
That's awesome,
fun.
man.
I've got like I don't know, there's like a 50K or 100K later this year, which I will be training for intensely. But yeah,
Yeah.
at the moment it's just covering mileage and seeing how far I can go before I break.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Wow. Do you know Ralph Elving from Gadget?
I don't. I do not.
He should connect to you guys. He lives in Canada, but he travels. I think it's to Sweden sometimes. Anyway, he's also kind of like an extreme sports hike run kind of guy. Sounds like you would enjoy one of his company.
Awesome. Yeah. Love to
Nature and
read one.
misery sounds like the themes I'm getting from there.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah,
clarity through hardship or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
uh, that's cool. Good for you. Well, for my purposes and sake of sharing what I've been doing, not much. I've been doing some Shopify work on functions, trying to de-ignorify myself,
Okay.
ignoranceify around some of those things. Met some interesting people along the way. Spent some time with Taylor, helping me do some
Yeah.
debugging using his GraphQL magistry, which I'm surprised you didn't mention that as a highlight of your week,
I
Taylor.
didn't want
Our
to
time
mention.
together.
I don't want to be
Yeah.
braggy.
Yeah. And then I have a private app I wrote a couple years ago for a client that I continue to maintain and run for them. And they occasionally have these issues I had to track down where like orders just were being picked up by my system for some reason. So having to go in and dig and figure out like what happened with the webhooks or whatever it might be. Was it someone in their store staff like created an order but didn't trigger the filters that I have to pick up certain? It's complicated, but gotta sort through that and get that all figured out. And yeah, same with you guys. It's been a mild spring here, so I've been enjoying the weather when I can, hanging out with the kids. And my son recently got into like tin whistles and recorders. My son's
Mhm.
pretty musical. He likes to do that kind of stuff, and I love him to death. But if you've ever been in a home with a child who plays a tin whistle or recorder nonstop, as loud
I
as he
don't.
can,
I don't even
it's
know what a
enough.
tin whistle is. So
Imagine
that's
the most
interesting.
annoying sound in the world, and
Time's about
it's like
four.
that. Yeah.
Have you
No,
got
they're
really
cool,
good
and he actually plays cool songs. It's just loud.
Um,
have you got good noise canceling headphones?
I do when my ears are
Yeah.
dry.
Yeah.
I put them in.
Fair play.
The inside joke. Yeah. All right. Well, people are probably thinking, let's talk enough about that. Let's talk about Shopify. So, Lee, one of the first things I like to do, I'm a history, contextual kind of guy, is understand where you're coming from, who you are. So tell us, how'd you get into Shopify development? Kind of what's your superhero backstory in terms of being Shopify dev, and let's go from there.
Oh, it's a relatively long sort of pathway. Before Shopify, I started an e-commerce platform that was sort of serving the African market for a number of years. About 400 odd merchants that were sitting on that for a number of years, which came with a whole bunch of challenges because there was no cloud infrastructure, there was nothing like that. So it started off as this little app that then turned into me working scaling a cloud provider that did bare metal servers across sort of three
Oh, wow.
geolocations in South Africa. And then, yeah, I mean, it sort of got to a point where I was aware of Shopify because obviously we were playing in the same space. We were sort of, that sort of 2010, I think I started hearing more about Shopify. 2012, it sort of started to be something where I'd notice a merchant that was using it within our sector. Um, Subsequently that project sort of came to end from like a financing standpoint. We shut it down 2015ish, and migrated everyone over to Shopify, which meant I learned a whole bunch really, really quickly about how to hack our way into running browser extensions to do CSV imports at bulk levels because the API wasn't sort of functional. Um, yeah, and sort of at the same time, I sort of migrated a couple of Magento stores across on Shopify. One of them was a Shopify Plus store in South Africa, which I had never heard of anyone else was on Shopify Plus at that point. But it sort of started this, yeah, sort of knowledge base that was all around the ecosystem. And between that and a bunch of sort of contract development work, which was pretty broad, I sort of worked as head of development for a company called Fuse, which is based out of Toronto. We sort of did gun for hire, front end interface, and sort of full stack projects for everyone from sort of NASA, Amazon, a number of really big sort of big firms throughout that space. Really interesting. And then, yeah, wound up back in the Shopify space at Blue Bolt, which was not a Shopify agency. They'd never done any Shopify. They sort of had an internal platform that was really successful in the UK. And then they migrated over to being a Shopify Shopify agency. And I was kind of the only person on the team who had any Shopify experience. So we did that, and the migration to the sort of Shopify Plus space, working primarily with enterprise customers, which has been their sort of target market for a number of years. So I suppose it's well over a decade's worth of Shopify playing around, hackery at all different levels, before then joining We Are 8, which was sort of off the back of some discussions and some technical architecture to scale them up for Black Friday on their big bundling app, Bundle Builder, which is pretty awesome, but does serious volume in terms of the sort of webhook load queuing. So that was kind of my entry into that. And so, yeah, I've sort of done a fair bit, sort of being the sort of basic partner, Shopify Plus partner, tech partner, you kind of name it. I think the only sort of one which I haven't bingoed off was to become a Shopify expert. I kind of just skipped that stage at the beginning and then just jumped over it. But I've just been playing bingo throughout the sort of engineering side of Shopify for a fair amount of time now, I suppose. If you want to get the backstory and the where I am, who I am, and how I got here.
Wow. What's interesting is that having been there in that space as long as you have, you probably have a lot of context around how Shopify has evolved over the years and how you kind of see that play out in some of the decisions they've made more recently. Has that been a helpful tool to have in your toolbox?
I think it's been really insightful to see how much extension has gone into Shopify and just how good it has become. And even, the sort of frustration points that I can think of from a number of years ago, just watching like the rapid evolution through areas. Something just like, like the new fulfillment orders management. It's just like I remember dealing with all of the chaos of trying to do updates and all the rest of it for years. To then look at these really highly structured, well thought out improvements. So I've just been so impressed with the speed at which the iteration has happened, and the sort of constant extension. So it definitely adds a good sort of tooling to the toolbox to know, hey, we used to do it like that, and every now and again you hit one of those things where it's like, hey, we got to get a bit hacky here. They'll probably patch something, there'll probably be an extension to this, but there's these approaches that we used to be able to get away with. Maybe we can try it. So I think there's a bit of that knowledge in there, definitely in the sort of problem solving, sort of goal chasing aspects.
What about Karl was asking a little bit about the insights that you have from seeing how things have changed. What would be some call outs that you have that like this has been consistent or constant with Shopify since since the beginning? Because it sounds like you started off with people where you're running your own like e-commerce platform, right?
Yeah.
And then you started just helping, like, hey, Shopify at the time, this is really the best option after we're
Yeah.
closing up shop. And then you just started helping people, even from like Magento, like we're moving people all over the place. But so what about that stayed constant throughout that time period?
I mean, so much of it has changed throughout that process. Like even if
Right.
you think
Yeah.
to theme dev, right? Yeah, like the early themes used to have a mobile and a desktop theme.
Yep.
Liquid
Uh-huh.
just wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't as it was fully functioned, but there's so much that's been included. You know, I think there's just so many of these massive game changers that have come in. Like if you just focused on themes, you could look at, you know, the evolution, obviously the drinking game that was sections everywhere, and how long that took to get out. Um,
Right.
Blocks, app blocks, the extension spaces that have happened on that side. Um, and then, yeah, the sort of evolution of web components is a major game changer for me. People
Hmm.
may not call that out, but the fact that just like hooking up events and hooking up things like that really was streamlined by things like Dawn coming in. Where I think
Hmm.
back to those sort of early ones, early iterations, yeah, there was loads of sort of hackiness. You were constantly hooking up event listeners and then figuring out what had changed here, and oh wait, all of this form's changed, and I built this thing custom onto some theme, and then they changed it out. So there's been a
Hmm.
lot of evolution on that side. Watching the sort of API go from sort of non-version to versioned was a
Hmm.
massive game changer. I remember a number of sort of breaking changes that happened sort of pre that, where you had something hooked up and all of a sudden it just stopped working. Um, and then the communication from Shopify, I think, also has been just phenomenal. Watching the sort of extension of documentation through that journey, like to
Hmm.
where it is now, where I think the docs are just, you can find pretty much anything you need to know at this point, where so often
Hmm.
it
Yep.
was half documented and you would have to go and figure it out and play with it for ages, and then you would find the caveat of something that was undocumented. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I think the constants have sort of been that. It's just that like it's been iterative in line with
Yeah. Change is the
changes at
constant,
all
huh?
levels.
Like it's evolved.
Change is the constant, and also to
Hmm.
sort of see the perception of Shopify change has been interesting.
Hmm.
That sort of, oh well, Magento was this thing, and if I think back, people almost viewed Shopify as not at the same caliber as somebody that was running on something else. And
Yeah.
it's been so interesting to watch that evolution happen within it. Even Demandware into sort of Salesforce Commerce, etc. The perceptions have changed so much around it, and with that that
Hmm.
perception is based off what is now an absolutely huge ecosystem with almost everything bolted in. So I think it's been interesting
Yeah.
to sort of, yeah, be a fly on the wall to that process, um, for
Yeah,
sure.
I say talking a little bit about like even the perception of Shopify changing, because I felt like at least early on when I was working in Shopify, almost having to convince the merchant that Shopify was the right choice. And now it maybe because like that's my changes, that's just what I do. I just do Shopify dev. So I don't have a lot of people coming towards me that don't do that. But I don't ever feel like I'm ever having to talk anybody into it anymore, right? Like I'm not having to talk
Yeah,
somebody out of like looking at like Magento or WooCommerce or whatever. It's just like, well, why wouldn't you choose Shopify? Like let's talk about that.
yeah,
It's just like a given at this point. So that's interesting. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think trying to call out constants is probably a little bit harder, especially with as much as Shopify has changed. So yeah,
yeah.
change being the constant's probably the best way to describe that, huh?
I mean, if anything, the one constant I would call out is stability. Like it's always been stable. We have the odd up and down, but
Yeah.
that's probably it. Everything else has been a merge of improvements.
Hmm.
Yeah. As a developer, it's obviously very easy to hate on the system that you're developing against. But I think you're right. It's sure there's nothing perfect about it, but it's been extremely robust in terms of the feature set it provides, the stability that it seems to present, and it's impressive. I wish we had more visibility into what went on behind the scenes over there. Maybe there is, I just haven't found it yet. But they have figured out how to do a engineering management culture there that seems to be really effective.
Yeah, I think it's been multiple iterations, and I think it
Yeah,
is
for sure.
massively effective. I'd love to see a documentary on the behind the scenes of Shopify at some point.
Yeah. Maybe we should just drive over to Toronto, or is it? No, it's not Toronto. It's
Ottawa.
that's my mind is slipping. Ottawa. Thank you.
Where you? It's the other O. Yeah.
I was just thinking Toronto because that's where Unite was, but no,
We just lost all of the Karl and I are out of the bingo here for our Shopify knowledge. Darn it!
Yeah. Toronto was the Unites mostly, weren't they? Or a couple before that.
Yeah. Did you go to any of those? Did we rub shoulders unknowingly?
Yeah. I went to what were the two Toronto ones? Two Torontos back to back. Yeah.
You're at 2019.
I was indeed. Yeah. Bright yellow shoes.
We were Lee. We could have been. Yeah.
I know.
I
They
don't
were
remember
talking
the
like
shoes, but
GraphQL and stuff, man. Like, I was.
I remember seeing that and thinking, "Oh boy."
Yeah. I was deep into a load of the tech things and going, "Oh, this is so cool. This is gonna do that." But yeah, 2019 was awesome.
Yep.
I miss Unite, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, I was just thinking that too. I mean, for the amount of work they put into it, I imagine they're getting a lot of other stuff done. Not that they're not having to think about that, but I do miss those opportunities.
So they did they did have a partner survey that came out. Did y'all see that around the last editions? And so there was a partner survey that went out after editions, and there is an opportunity in there to mark, or they had it as an option that you want more in-person events. And so we were trying to get that moving on Twitter. It was like, everybody put in-person events again. Let's bring it back.
Let's bring it back.
Because I unfortunately did not get to go to any of those, so I would love the opportunity to be able to go do something like that in person. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, they did. They did one in Amsterdam called Pursuit, which was really good. Just before the COVID lockdowns kicked in, that was really enjoyable. And I know there was varying sort of perceptions on it, but they sort of did Shopify Unite, the sort of London one, which was more like a day with Shopify, like a bit of dev, sort of like really dev heavy, some office hours and stuff like that. It was really good as well. So yeah, in persons would be great to see back.
Agreed.
Now, Taylor, I know you had some questions about just the different things that Leigh has done in terms of agencies plus agency tech marketer stuff. I have some technical questions. So do you want to dig into some more of your stuff first before we go down the technical path? Or do you think you got answers?
I think we can dig into the technical stuff. I think that's what a lot of people are really interested. I think that's a good use of Leigh's time, considering his background too.
Yeah.
Dig into whatever.
So we got a couple notes here, Leigh. But one of the things that you mentioned as a possible topic I was really interested in was leveraging the internals of Shopify. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, it's sort of something that's been kicking about, and I've seen a few approaches, and it's starting to become something that is quite heavy in the sort of extensions and the sort of function space of really leveraging metafields for data from your app. Where I think, in a lot of the sort of Shopify app, if you want to call it traditional app sort of architecture, databases become a key. Everyone like merges everything into the database, and then they sort of, in this case, are generally writing it back to metafields. And I think there's sort of room there with how good sort of meta objects are getting, with how good sort of the metafields through the sort of GraphQL API, etc. are of really leveraging that for much more of the data, which then allows you to surface it easier into themes if you want to do it. So bringing in additional custom fields or something like that, where I still see a lot of apps will push towards using an app proxy, hitting your API, hitting your database, bringing back data, where if you almost viewed Shopify's metafields and the sort of meta objects and definitions, etc., across the board as part of your data schema as sort of day one, you can really streamline and speed up a lot of those calls, which, number one, they drop down your database costs in a big way, especially if you're hitting it constantly. Anything customer, client side, etc. And then the performance side going into the sort of customer experience. You got to get a little bit creative with it, but I've seen a few sort of folks really leveraging that approach, and we're now seeing it as almost first party through, as I said, functions and the extensions, where that's the approved way to get data for the vast majority, and then getting creative with how you could manage stuff in that space.
Well,
So yeah,
I'm curious if you know offhand, as far as I know, like, because we're talking about like metafields, metaobjects, custom data on Shopify, right?
yeah.
So I know offhand there's a limit per shop at the moment, at least, for meta objects per shop. At like
Per shop,
I
yeah.
think it's like
Don't know what
64,000 or something like that. Kind of.
Yeah.
I think it's 64,000 is what I've seen as far as like the
Yeah.
number that gets called out specifically. But I don't know if do you know if there's a limit for metafields on a shop? Because if we have a limit for meta objects, but not necessarily that I've ever seen one specific to metafields.
I'm dead sure there is a limit on metafields,
Sure.
but
Like there's got
I know
right?
that I know that as a like random experiment, we had a loop that was just creating metafield after metafield after metafield, and we never tapped it out. And it was like 25 minutes later that we stopped it. So, like, it's a lot, And I think if you then get
It's a lot. Whatever the number is, it's a lot.
whatever it is, unless they've reduced it down. But we never hit it. I don't know if there's any sort of like sub namespace ones.
Yeah.
Whether there's additional limits throughout there. And one of the overheads of doing something like pushing data into metafield is then being very careful and strategic with your data, your sort of your garbage collection. Of don't leave, like, especially if there are limits, it's like, how quickly do you remove that thing? And making sure you remove it. And it's not for every single use case, but I think in a lot of them, people just forget about it. They forget about it as being a viable data point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I know that was just like the pushback from some devs as far as like that's what everybody immediately concerned was like, what's the limit? Even if it's a crazy number, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the limit? Like, you want to know like what you actually have to be concerned about. So I was curious if you did know that offhand. Limit. I do know. Yeah, I was say I know there's even like a storage limit, right? Like a file storage limit on Shopify shops, but there've been instances, at least that I've seen, where you can reach out to support and they'll increase it for that shop or whatever. But there is kind of like this soft limit or whatever where you just have to talk to support kind of type thing.
I mean, we've seen that over the years, though, of like limits getting hit and then getting revised. So I think as I said, in terms of the metafield side, I haven't really hit any of them. The limit, which I would worry about more than the actual limit of metafields, is how quickly you could access stuff or update via API, and how many throttles you would potentially hit if you were constantly updating. Especially if you've got multiple operations through your app happening, you could potentially saturate your bucket pretty quickly.
That is the one thing about that approach too. Is like, I think most of us know, or if you don't know, it's easy to find documentation around what to expect out of a proper database in terms of the sort of guarantees you get, the way you can work with the data. Yeah. Metafields, obviously, like you said, way more performant in the sense you don't have to make that trip back, but it's a little bit of the Wild West in terms of data integrity and some other things that you're thinking through or might want to consider for your app, right? And even stuff like, I was talking to a gentleman on SPS Slack, how functions can't access meta objects, but they can access meta fields, and part of that is a performance concern internal to Shopify. So there's just a lot of like gotchas maybe still out there to take into consideration.
For sure. There was somebody, and I apologize to whoever it was on Twitter that was talking about somebody building a viable ORM for Shopify metafields, like literally like an SDK. Just trying, literally off the top of my head, I can't recall who it was, but I thought it was a really interesting.
I know who you're talking about. I'm gonna try and find it.
Yeah. I sort of like at that point was kind of thinking, maybe just building a quick SDK that just does metafield management, just the GraphQL, update to try and keep that. But I haven't got to that point of having a couple hours to thrash at it.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, obviously the other big thing too is you wouldn't be able to really query against metafields like you would in a SQL database, right? So depending on what the purpose of that data is,
Yeah.
if you want to run reports on it, things like that, right? But versus just storing some state, that seems like that's where it would really shine.
Yeah. I mean, I think that some of the approaches could be to view it almost as cache. So
Mm,
you do store something into a database, and then you maintain the integrity from your database, but you take the overhead of client-side requests out of that mix. You take
yeah,
the security of client-side requests out of that mix. Um, something like that would probably be an approach that would be quite viable.
interesting. Now you mentioned it, when you first started talking about this how it could really help in terms of reducing costs of the database for an app. So I've never operated something at that scale where I would be concerned about that as much. So what are some of the things that people who don't have experience of scaling a really high use app might not even thinking about that they could benefit from using something like Metafield?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many really good cloud databases now, which are very cost effective. So you're not having to think about it as much as it would have been a factor a couple of years back. Um, but the one big factor is anything that's client. So, if you've got an app and it's going onto a customer front end and that's hitting your database, you're dealing with somebody else's traffic hitting you all the time. There's not necessarily any revenue that's being generated by each one of those requests. So anything that you can do in that cache layer to try and reduce how much overhead, how much processing cost you've got, how much storage cost you've got on your databases is something that, yeah, should always be thought about. Number one, you're also, in some cases, you see an app sort of go down under load, and that breaks a storefront, that stops a checkout or stops an ads cart. So that layer there, the cost can escalate very quickly, and it can escalate very quickly not based on actual app operations. And I think being really careful with that and taking that into account is something that most people don't think about until they hit the first sort of time that you get that type of load, or your app suddenly gets installed by a really big store and you all of a sudden have serious traffic that's hitting you, um, which is an awesome problem to have. Like, this is, that's what we are all in this for. Um, but it's something like to sort of like have in the back of your mind is like, don't over engineer early, but be ready when you need to. And I think, yeah, in a lot of the stuff where it's sort of like client side speed and performance first and foremost, how can you be the most performant in that space? So yeah, it's they're just sort of interesting approaches, which I think um, can definitely like reduce your overhead and your risk factor, both in terms of cost and in terms of perception with all the rest of your merchants that are all connected to that same database effectively.
That's a good point. Yeah, I don't know. I can't speak for all of our listeners, but I figure a lot of people's experience probably doesn't get to the point where that becomes a concern. But you're right. You always kind of hope that maybe it would, because that is a pretty nice sign in terms of success. And it's good to keep that in mind in terms of what you would do when you're in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, like there's a lot of the single app devs within the app ecosystem, which is awesome. Um, but yeah, you don't want your app to go down based on something else. So like if there's something where you can reduce your overhead, if your database is costing you 20 grand a month and you can drop it right down to two or whatever, that's a massive game changer. And I would say, yeah, over my time, it's normally anything that's a client side request that you can't control, um,
Right.
or some of the ones which have been pretty nasty that I've sort of been off the back of is something like an app that does something that then goes into a loop and triggers your same page
Oh,
600 times and does 600 requests every single time somebody goes into the same page, and you suddenly get
oof.
this massive spike through the roof. Um, so yeah, I've sort of troubleshot a lot of those, and I think just taking a little bit of a think before it and almost saying, how am I going to cache this? whether you can put something like Redis up front or whatever to reduce that, which is awesome. But I think just as viably, there are options within the Shopify ecosystem where
Yeah.
you could trigger something off the back of it, update a metafield on change, same as Redis.
So there's some really good points about the data store and the caching layer, but I'd be curious, note on here, like just what is your take on some of the different options people even have to approach app development to begin with in terms of languages and frameworks? So you obviously have a lot of experience.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that a little bit.
I mean, start building an app in whatever you're comfortable in is kind of the starting. Unless you want to learn something that's brand new, like if you're in that learning space and you haven't touched some framework, go with that. But I generally tend to say to people, like, if you're a single app dev and you're just trying to get your head around it, get the fundamentals of app development in the framework that you are comfortable with. Obviously, Shopify's sort of core starters, like Remix now, I think is the new one, which has gone in there. Remix pretty solid. I'm a fan of Next.js. Have been for a long time. I'm a big fan of the JavaScript ecosystem as a whole. So, Ruby's there's a lot of stuff for Ruby. If you're really comfortable in Ruby, it's kind of batteries included. There's a lot of gems that are in there, and that's always been the fundamentals behind it,
That was the answer Karl was looking for.
I was just waiting for you to say Ruby. Unprompted. Yeah. Everyone noticed.
Unprompted. Yeah, I mean, I think, but like if I was scaling a team, and I'll be first person to put my hand up and say, look, JS TypeScript side is generally my approach, because you can bring in somebody that's a JavaScript developer that can move from front end to back end. You generally get one language. Whether it's the most performant option out there, no, it isn't going to be. If you went with a Go back end and some other type of other front end, it would probably be more performant. Ruby can be a little bit challenging to scale, but it's stable. And the historically it's been out there. But yeah, if I was scaling a team just in terms of like hiring and bolstering a sort of growing app, I personally would go the sort of TypeScript type route, because it does really translate almost across everything at this point. Whether you go Remix, whether you go Next.js, whether you go something else, it doesn't really matter. There's 1,000 different approaches out there to achieve it.
Taylor, I feel like I'm dominating the conversation a little bit. You got something you want to toss out there? No?
Well, that's okay, man. Like I said, I get too chatty, so every now and again, if you're gonna run, like I said, it's a good use of Leigh's time to flex the tech stuff. I still stick to themes, and so Leigh's background is really heavy, and I'm really interested in some of the stuff around like database management with metafields and those sorts of things too. Just in general, but again, mainly because I think it's really, there's a lot of conversations about that right now, but I haven't, as someone who relies on tutorials to hack their way through things like, checkout extensions or whatever, to push up a couple of extensions only apps for Plus clients that I'm working with, because we can't use checkout.liquid anymore. I'm really intrigued to hear about a lot of this. I just don't see a lot of like good examples of it in the wild, I guess. And that probably is more so like my failings as far as understanding leveraging that fun stuff with GraphQL.
I don't think,
because you really have to, right?
I don't think you would really ever see it in the you might hear somebody talking about it, but I don't know who else is actually doing it at scale. I know, like Bundle Builder, we were doing something with like our feature flags were all being stored to metafields to enable disable stuff, which is really cool. And I mean, from the theme side, like the theme app extensions, like you could build some pretty phenomenal stuff, which is very, very close to sort of theme dev, extension only app that delivers.
Which I didn't even realize that. Yeah, I was recently talking to another dev about a project, and they were asking about the app embed blocks and all this other stuff or whatever. For the app, and I didn't realize like how simple some of that stuff was, even, right? Like as far as
block,
like just like add that in. Yeah, so I was like,
So
oh man, this is still just theme dev, man. This is cool. I could rock this.
for folks that are familiar with theme app extensions and theme blocks, could you give a high level of what that is so people can understand?
Yeah. So the theme app
Yeah, so
extensions.
and say
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
do you
hit
want to
that,
go,
Lee.
Taylor? You go.
No,
I mean,
you hit that, and I'll fill
sure.
in the gaps for us theme
Fill in
devs
the
who don't
gaps.
understand you smart people.
I mean, theme app extensions are effectively liquid. Yeah, they're effectively a liquid block that gets distributed by Shopify. It gets deployed by the app into the store, and you don't have to make any changes to themes. You don't have to have access to the Assets API to install stuff. When somebody uninstalls or changes theme, they're still there. They can enable them, disable them. There's no custom work that goes around them. So, definitely from an app standpoint and an app support standpoint, they're awesome because for a lot of cases you can turn stuff on and off. Obviously, the risk factor that a lot of people talked about is that the older themes, the pre-OS2 themes, um, didn't have support, but embeds will work on those themes. So embeds are basically embedding a script tag or turning something on that's just there on every single page or there on a specific page across the board, versus an app block, which you drop into a section wherever there's a block and it has an app tag that you can drop it onto. But fundamentally, they use the same setting schema as sort of section blocks, and I don't know if anything's going to change around this with the new nested blocks, whether you'll be able to nest blocks within your blocks, because that's going to be really interesting. If it is, if it is that is a massive game changer in terms of apps being able to deliver really complex, almost section level blocks into themes without having to do any custom code really. Uh, but yeah, I think that's a really high level, Taylor. I don't know whether that kind of covers what you would have said on it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic um, overview there, and I think probably the best thing is always like talking about like the application, right? Like typically with what we would see. So the actual app block itself, merchants can add directly from the customizer, right? And they can do that, and there's a lot of simple examples of that. Whether it's you just want to be able the simple ability to add some additional icons, maybe that your app doesn't
Yeah.
include, or you need to do something to interface with your app as well, kind of type thing. Maybe some timed like promotion sales and stuff like that you want to conditionally show. And the embed block. Well, there's the app blocks, right, and then the embed block, which is more like you had mentioned too, and that's a good call out as far as those being supported on even vintage themes, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't need the JSON template; it's just something they can turn off and on, and it's how app devs now can get around instead of having to like inject a script or something like that for custom functionality directly into a theme. We can just turn this on and we can use that to serve like our JavaScript that we need in order for that functionality to work. So that those are at least the most common use cases that I see for stuff like that. At least in general, that's what you'll see. But yeah, that was a mind blowing for me as a theme dev. When like and another app dev sent me this and was like, hey, like, do you want to maybe work on something like this? And I was like, well, I'm really not comfortable enough like building for app stuff. And they're like, no, this is just liquid, man. This is just like you could run this. I was like, oh yeah, cool. Like, let's do it. So, and it was just something he didn't want to mess with or whatever. And they already had an existing app architecture in place, so it was just more, additional work. So as far as other, front end devs and stuff like that, it's good introduction maybe to again starting to inch your way towards app development. And we've talked a little bit about apps and themes. You've talked about like seeing the constant evolution. I'm curious on your take from my perspective. So maybe Karl, I'm taking over a little bit here and asking some of my less technical questions. But what you see is the writing on the wall for maybe people who are strictly like theme devs or whatever. The thing that I'm seeing is this constant push towards extensibility. And when we're talking about extensibility in Shopify, at least in the way that it's currently being communicated, it talked about and across all different aspects of the shop, is app development. We're losing ground as front end devs on what we can customize, right? So like we're the new customer accounts and then new
Yeah.
customer accounts extensibility is all app development. Like we don't have an account.liquid, that we can customize or do whatever kind of type thing. When people are migrating towards that, right? We're still kind of in that middle space, but as far as what do you see as part of that, given your background and how you've seen things move, is there going to be this like continual shrinking ground? Because you actually touched on it a little bit here, where like if app embed blocks also support nesting, all of a sudden this is brand new territory for apps to start coming in and becoming very customized, where I can buy an app instead of this dev's time or whatever.
I think you kind of need to go 2 layers back in that question of like when
Mm-hmm.
you view theme dev, the theme is the delivery of something, right? It's the delivery mechanism for liquid onto it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I would expect, especially like obviously there is a little bit more complexity when you get into the sort of React or the extension type space where there's a fixed framework behind it. But
Right.
it's primarily front end dev. Like
Yeah.
in reality, right? It's an extension of front end dev knowledge, and I think any front end developer will go through changes and will adapt to new technologies continually throughout whatever their career is. So if you kind of take it back and you
100%.
view it as the app is just a mechanism to deliver that front end code, it
Mm-hmm.
becomes sort of different. Now, if you think from like a theme developer or somebody that's used to sort of extending themes or extending themes for merchants, you kind of get to the point of going, well, I'm going to have my app that has all of these blocks ready to go. Now you've got a component library
Yeah.
of stuff that's ready to be installed. So if you think
Mm-hmm.
about it in terms of like the evolution of historical theme dev, of going to a theme, do some customization, leave that theme in whatever state, you're now taking 10 steps back and going, hey, I'm going to build up this component library. I'm going to build up this really awesome slideshow or this really awesome feature that does
Mm-hmm.
whatever. You can now install it on that app, on that theme, if you get to it. And it's not, you've talked about extension only apps. Extension only apps, relatively easy to
Mm-hmm.
build. There's a starter kit for it, and you're up and running. A couple
Yep.
of CLI commands, and not much more complex than a theme startup command, right? You've got an app
Right.
lock, and so I think to a lot of degrees, I would be saying to anybody that's in the theme exclusive space, of start thinking about what benefits that brings and what that delivery mechanism is. Because if you had a hack Friday,
Mm-hmm.
I guarantee you would get a theme extension up and running, right? Theme app extension,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
guaranteed. And if somebody really
Yep.
leveraged that and said, well, I can do my custom app that does this, and it has all of this stuff, I can enable this for you, I can bring this block in. All of that code is theme agnostic. So if that customer wants
Right.
to go and update their theme, pull another one off there, your work still stands as long as you've architected your front end to be as self-contained as possible, which I think is something which
Right.
like Dawn really highlighted to a very wide audience, but it's something which is a massive benefit of just if you can make stuff self-contained. So your block will
Mm-hmm.
style itself. Your block will adapt to whatever it is, or it'll have enough functionality to be able to bring it in there. Um, I would
Right. And that's
say,
leveraging web components, like you referenced earlier too, right? That's what you're talking about. Really,
yeah,
as
great
far as what
approach to
Don
that
did well there. Mm-hmm.
for sure. You know, really getting to grips with that, and yeah, it might be stepping out. I know that there are some people that tend to shy away from JavaScript wherever possible, but my sort of perception forward would be heavily leverage that. Don't think about it taking away from the viability, but think about it as just another
Mm-hmm.
delivery channel for your work, and a delivery channel which fundamentally drops the overhead that you have in the long run.
Right.
That
Mm-hmm.
that would be my
Yeah,
take
and
on it, I
much more
guess.
complex version of that too. Yeah, would be like Anne and Trudy's design packs. Like I'm sure you've seen that
Yeah,
on the App Store, where they've got all these custom sections that they can inject directly into shops and stuff like that. And that's
yeah,
that's a much more elevated version of that, the simple extension part, right? Or whatever,
Yeah.
but like done very well. Like
Oh,
they've got
amazingly.
some
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
tremendous value that they provide for folks.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really great perspective to look at that, is just kind of seeing that as the medium for how we get to
Yeah,
that point. That's a
it's the
really good way to look
transport
at that.
mechanism. It's the bus. And I
Mhm.
think, like, if you take it back to that, instead of saying it's taking away from my viability, is how can I use this
Sure.
knowledge that I have and really like leverage into it. I
Yeah.
think that there's other spaces which are likely to get impacted around the sort of AI space, and I'm sure you guys seen like Dev Zero by Vercel, which is like all AI like going into it. Like
Mhm.
some of the playground stuff that I've been throwing around in the cave has been around building themes directly with generative. And I think we're going to see some of that kicking in the coming years.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting space to look into there. So I think it's one of those we've talked about. We probably need to like dedicate a whole episode at some point just talking about all the AI stuff or whatever,
Yeah.
because we're still kind of in that middle ground of like there's some really cool stuff you can do with that, but when it falls on its face, it falls hard. And
oh
so
yeah,
like you have
when it
to
fails,
you
it
have
fails
to have
hard.
stuff to
Yeah,
it does. And so
yeah,
you've gotta have some contingencies built in there when you want it when you want to use it for anything that would be mission critical, right? So
yeah.
uh, yeah.
Well, as we get kind of near the end and needing to transition to the second half of our show, uh, just as a parting thought, Lee, do you have any comments around AI that you want to impart to users? How do you see it impacting the Shopify space or app development, theme development, anything along those lines?
Look, I think it isn't a matter of whether it's going to impact it. It's how it's going to impact it and how that's going to
Right.
evolve. You know, AI is out there. I think it's already impacting it with folks using Copilot, with things like that, whether you see it or not, right? It's already making those moves, and I think one of the key takeaways that I would have just around AI is just being open to it and understanding where it is, because so often the response that I get from developers is, oh, that's not it, and it's almost this like factor of fear of that's going to take my job, it's going to take away my validity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where I think we need obviously some careful oversight into where AI goes. We've said, when it fails hard, but
Mm-hmm.
just being open to where it's going to go. And I would say we're going to see a lot of, we're already seeing it throughout with a lot of the Shopify Magic stuff, with the descriptions and things are really awesome in that space. And I think when it starts heading into the theme space, you know, there's there's a huge amount of room in there for, hey, I want to build a new page, selecting from the 10 different sections that are available and outputting it. That there's a lot of power that I think is going to get in there to sort of streamline merchant tasks, and just sort of being ready to leverage anything that we build into that space.
Yeah.
Would be my key takeaway, is just being open to it. um, yeah, and I think that there really is just awesome development going on in that space. You could definitely dedicate an entire episode into what are the pros and cons, what are the different tools. I think it's the fastest like evolution of tools I've seen in my sort of dev career has been in the last sort of year in terms of AI tooling.
Mm-hmm.
Whether all of it's valid or not, whether it's just shoehorning AI into everything is beside the point. But yeah, I think it's an exciting time,
And
and I
using it's
think
pretty much replaced all my time on Stack Overflow. So there's not a whole lot of quick back and forth I can't get from just a quick little Copilot, prompt to what I would normally have like tried to find on Stack Overflow.
I have a love-hate relationship with Copilot. I kind of find it
Yeah.
like having like an intern developer sitting next to me that sometimes writes good code.
Mm-hmm.
But 9 times out of 10, I just have
Yep.
to reverse engineer what it was actually doing when I ask it to do something. So I
Well,
tend,
and that's what I like, because I don't know if you have this to where sometimes, if you ask a question where you can't quite figure out the problem, it's like just barely out of your grasp, and then you can give somebody else this prompt, right? And then they spit something back at you, like, no, that's wrong, and here's why. And then all of a sudden, I've solved my problem. Like for whatever reason, the back and forth bounce, right, is
Well,
just like, oh, bam, there it is, you
but
know? Um, yeah,
I mean, do you have a rubber duck on your desk?
that's
Every,
I use I've got a couple of friends that I use for rubber ducks.
okay.
Hey,
Slack
Uh,
people is I'm sorry, Carl.
I mean,
But yeah, it's exactly that. It is a lot of times my rubber duck. If it's not something
yeah.
super simple, right? Like I'll use it for I don't want to have to like type out this whole event listener or whatever that I'm running for this. So like, bam, spit this out. Regex is great. If I'm like in this old thing that has a ton of jQuery and I'm like, I'm not going to rewrite this in vanilla JavaScript. I'm just going to copy and paste it and say rewrite this in vanilla JavaScript, and it does it for you really, really well. So
I
that kind of type
mean,
stuff, like really like functional utility type stuff, solid.
maybe it's time for like a Liquid Weekly Chat GPT-S, and we'll just build one called the Rubber Duck, which is designed specifically to do all of that and
There you
respond
go.
right.
as
That
a
would be
duck.
awesome.
Right? Yeah.
That would be awesome.
not sure it'll be all it's quacked up to be, but we'll see.
Oh.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Ooh.
Taylor, do you have anything for a changelog or listener questions or anything like that this week?
Oh man. So as far as like the listener questions,
Did you make that one up,
this
or was
is
that a real one?
no, that's a real one. Carl's asking because it's kind of like freelancer specific, and so we all do a bit of consulting and freelancing and contract work kind of type thing or what have you. And that was one of the listener submitted questions was asking about how you get clients. Would you recommend partnering with agencies? There's a whole bunch of other questions, and so I don't know if it's something that we should probably do. It's a little bit off topic for today, but or I don't know, like how you feel
All
about
right.
that one. We could
30
always surface
seconds,
that
Lee.
later
How do you
too.
get clients?
Yeah, you use other people to get clients. I'm terrible at sales. So, but I mean, it also depends on
Yes.
what type of like freelancer, right? Like are we talking content? We're
Hmm.
calling talking development, etc. And then if it's talking development, yeah, start working with agencies. Start working with other folks that are already active within the expert space or other front freelancers to pick up the gaps where their skills sort of leave off, and then just being dependable. But yeah, I'm pretty useless at business development. So yeah, I would say try and partner with folks that are good at business development. Unless you're a really good business development freelancer, in which case you partner with other people to do theirs for them.
That's right. That's great advice. Um, I mean, obviously we could talk a whole episode about that, but we have to move
Yeah.
on. So, Taylor, changelog, anything you want to point out for this week?
Yeah. So for the changelog, just real quick hits as far as like stuff that's interesting. Really, there's a handful of things in here for like for apps specifically. There's a new category page ads for the Shopify App Store. I think folks were kind of jazzed about that, mainly because I don't know about y'all. If you've had to look for an app for a client lately, it is hard to find stuff in there. Like I feel like I cannot navigate the App Store anymore. So I think this is helpful that they're trying to provide some more surface areas for just apps to be surfaced. So hopefully that's helpful to some degree and what have you. Also thought it was really interesting in the changelog. I posted about this on Twitter, and that the app submissions now require a screencast demo, and it's hilarious because all of the more veteran app devs who've like just submitted a bunch of apps before were like, isn't this already a requirement? Like, are you serious? And I think it's just because it was never an actual written requirement. It was just the constant feedback has been like, we need
It
a
was a
screencast demo.
recommendation.
Yeah,
It was a
maybe it was a recommendation.
recommendation on the original page, whatever it was. It used to have a recommendation of
Uh-huh.
do a screencast, but it wasn't like a you have to do a
Yep.
screencast. Now I think it's you
Yep.
have to do a
Now
screencast.
it's a straight up requirement.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think enough folks who had done it before were just like, look, I'm gonna have to do this anyways. And so I'm just gonna go ahead and do it on the submission anyways, because most folks were just like, is this not already a requirement? Like, so I thought that was really interesting. And there were a handful of folks that, on the positive end too, they just said, hey, like you can use this later on for, your app, your documentation purposes. So like it's, do a decent screencast that could be used also for customers, and you can find some really good value in your time there. Then the other side, because I don't want to take up too much time here and extend this a little bit, but the scheduled tab at the moment is chock full of stuff, which I thought was super interesting. Usually we don't see it this full until we're kind of like ramping up to like additions, but I don't know if this is just like one of those things where it's they're doing a better job of trying to surface stuff that's scheduled out. So I've seen this a bit with like check out extensibility has this great like roadmap of all the stuff that they're going to be building out. They're working towards. Really interesting if you are a dev at all working in this space. Definitely make sure you're checking out the scheduled tab just to see stuff. If you want to try to get ahead of stuff, see stuff coming down the pipe. That's always a great call out.
That's really cool. Thank you, Taylor. All right, so let's wrap up our episode with my favorite thing, which is our pick of the week, which is where we choose something. Doesn't have to be Shopify related, just anything in life that we've enjoyed or found interesting or want to pass along to other people. So, Leigh, what's your pick of the week? Do you have one? Put you on the spot.
Shopify managed installations for apps. Been playing with it. Really nice and streamlined. Specify your scopes up front, do your installation. The app loading experience is great. It doesn't do a backwards and forwards authentication, so you don't see the app, then see something else, then see the app again. Really impressed with that. I don't know how I'd sort of even missed that getting announced, but I kind of picked it up off the back of something else and had to play with it this week. I was really impressed with it.
I was going to say, I had not heard about that at all, so I'm definitely excited to go check that out. Thanks for the heads up. I'll go next, and then we'll have you close
Do
today,
it.
Taylor. So mine, I was accused of picking this one before, and I probably did, but it's so good. I got it again on clearance at Kroger. I don't know if I'd pay full price for it, but crack corn. Yes, it's called crack corn.
Crack with a
Krack.
K.
Yeah,
Okay.
which works as Carl with a K, but it's really good. Caramel corn, and they have a new flavor apparently now, the cheese caramel corn, which I haven't found locally yet, but I'm working to track it down. So if the crack corn people are listening, first of all, you guys should be on Shopify if you're not already. Second of all, send me some product. I'd be happy to promote it. And yeah, if you see it in the store, grab it. It's delicious. Taylor?
Be on Shopify if you're not. Have you ever tried? This is an aside related, because you are a snack guy. Have
I
you ever
am.
tried to make caramel corn at home?
I have. It's painful.
It is painful, but it is very, very good.
So it's crack
But if
corn.
crack corn is really good, maybe you just don't even have to worry about it. So my pick of the week is going to be the Shopify Partner Slack. I'm picking it because I end up referencing this so much as far as helpful resources and those sorts of things. There's some really cool people in there. It's how I met Leigh first off and stuff. He was helping me through an issue at the time. I was trying to work through a theme, and he pointed me to the right towards the right way to get that resolved and those sorts of things. So if you are wanting to find good value in there, there's also just people in there. I don't know. I'm maybe a bit odd, but I like to read through other people's questions because I think other people ask better questions than I do. Because sometimes I just don't even know what kind of questions I should be asking. So seeing those questions and responses from people, like Leigh, who jump in and save the day and stuff like that, or whatever, when somebody like me is trying to fumbling through stuff, I think that's a really, really good space to be able to do that. So Shopify Partner Slack, you can get to it from your partner dashboard even. Check it out.
Awesome. Well, we have officially wrapped another exciting episode. Leigh, again, thank you for making time to join us from London. And Taylor, it's always good to see your face. And for those of you that made it this far, we appreciate you sticking with us. And we'll see you in the next one. Happy hacking.